Hey there, welcome to episode 8 of this Koala Sampler tutorial series, and what we're talking about today is the edit window and the functions that become available to us once we've brought some samples onto our pads. So you can see I've got two samples loaded up here. Whatever sample we are currently using is highlighted in red, so when we apply some of these, whether it's volume or pitch, it's going to be applied to the highlighted pad, and that's really cool because sometimes when you've got a lot of pads going on, it's not so easy to work out which one you're on unless you have this nice little layer red highlight here. So the first three options are very basic. Volume, of course, is just going to adjust the volume of the pad that's selected. Pitch, if I play this little sample here, you'll be able to hear me adjust the pitch. Really useful. And then the last one here is pan, and I'll do the same thing. You can hear that that's just panning it left and right within the stereo field. So when you get into like mixing and doing stuff like that, it becomes useful to be able to start like spacing your instruments out. Now, as you can just see what I did there, if any of these you've just messed about with and you want to put them back to where they were, just double click them and it will reset them to their sort of default values. Now, we can also delete whatever is the highlighted pad here. We've got a nice delete button, but we can also do the delete, which I showed you in another video, just by dragging up and putting it in the bin there, which is kind of my go-to method. On whatever pad we have selected, we can open up our editing window. And let's start with the editing waveform viewer at the top here. It's nice and clear, really easy to use. If you want to zoom in, this is all iOS based, but I'm assuming for Android it'll be very similar. I use two fingers here. I can just zoom right into that waveform. Very handy when you want to start like cropping things down. And I'm just kind of, if I hold two fingers, I can just slide the waveform along as well. So I want to just move things, just move the whole waveform along. Two fingers will do that. And then pinching it back in brings it all back into sort of view. Next, we've got the start and end point handles. These are very important because, of course, that's how we start editing the samples. Our drum loop starts like this. Let's say I wanted to start from the snare drum here. I can do that. And of course, you've got an end point. So let's just say we only wanted the snare drum. We can do that. What's really cool is that as we move it along here, you can see on the pad it also changes. I think that's like really useful because it just gives you a good visual indication of what's going on. Especially when this window is then closed, I can see that I've just got like one little drum sample loaded up here, and then we can put it back. The next thing to talk about is the sort of modes that we've got along the bottom here. We'll start with one shot. So by default, unless you have one shots turned on by default, which I showed you in the settings menu, your samples come in like this, and they'll only play when I press my finger on the pad. And it stops whenever I take my finger off. One-shot mode means that it will play through the whole sample. And then if we hit loop, we can loop up whatever sample is loaded, particularly useful for things like this where it's a drum loop. And it stops when you tap the button again. We'll take those off. We've got reverse, which is going to do what it says. It's going to reverse the sample. Very useful creatively. Then what we've got are these two little arrow icons underneath where our options are. Doesn't matter whether you go to the left or the right, you're always just going to loop back around to whatever options you had. So we started with this one shot. If we go one click to the right, we get to attack, release, and tone. Now, attack and release, I look at those, if you're unfamiliar with these terms, if this like sampling workflow is a bit new to you, attack and release is, for me, I look at it as like fade in and fade out of your samples. That's the easiest way to explain it. If I click on this little road shot thing we got here, and let's set that to a one shot so it just keeps playing the sample through. We can see from our waveform, it's got a nice sort of sharp start and a sharp end point. And then if we go back to attack and release, so as I drag up attack here, and it depends on your amount, you can do a tiny little bit of attack, which is useful for sometimes like just taking out, if you find there's a little click or a pop at the end or the beginning of your sample, just using a really tiny amount of attack and release can sometimes just be enough to get rid of that little click and pop. But if we use quite a lot of it, you will see that what we get is like a fade into the sample instead of like this harsh beginning. So we're essentially just doing that. We're fading the sample in. And release is the exact opposite of that. If I play it again, just got a really sharp cutoff there. You'll also notice that if I hold down a pad for a while, sometimes you get the option to do the like dragging it up to the bin. Just be careful with your fingers when you're messing about with it. But yeah, you'll see that we get a really sharp cutoff at the end of the sample. If we adjust our release here, it does the same. A tiny little bit is only applying a very small amount of fade out to the very end of the sample, so you won't really hear it. But if I apply a lot, you can see we start and then it just fades out. So just think about attack and release as your fade in and fade out. Tone is essentially like a pretty crude EQ. So inside a Koala, one of its limitations is that it has no standard EQ. So if you've got a DAW of some sort, you're used to using Ableton or whatever, you're always going to see your like mids, highs and lows, like typical EQ that you can dial in. You don't have those in here. What you have is essentially like a high pass, low pass filter. And I'll go back to the drums and demonstrate it. So the drums sound like this. As we bring the tone down to the left, we're going to take out any high-end information. And when we do the opposite and we take it to the right, we reduce any low-end information. And of course, depends on the amount that you apply, how much you want to do of that. So you can EQ samples, and when we start talking a little bit more about that in the like perform effects page and stuff like that, I will show you more tips and tricks on how to do that. But think of tone as like a very basic EQ function. If we scroll along, we've got choke groups here. Again, I'm going to go into choke groups in more detail in the sort of sample slicing video, just because there's more to talk about. But very basically, choke groups, if you're not familiar with them, we can apply a choke group to each of these. So at the moment, if I wanted to play both of these samples at the same time, I can. Actually, I'll tell you what, we need to turn the choke groups to off because they're currently set. But I could play both of these now. Now, when you slice like some sort of melodic sample, or sometimes with drums, you kind of want to be able to do what is essentially called choking the pad. So when I play one pad and then I play the next one, I don't want them to overlap in any way. I just want to be able to play one pad at a time and have it essentially choke the other pad off. And that's what these groups are for. So if I want to do that with these two, I just pick this one, set it to choke group 1, and set this to choke group 1. Now I can only play one of these pads at a time. You can see it won't let me play both of them at the same time. Now, there's a bunch of different groups, and I said I'll go into a more detailed explanation of choke groups when we get to like the slicing video. But bear in mind that you've got a bunch of different groups to choose from, because sometimes you don't want to set all your choke groups to the same thing. Sometimes I want the drums to be in choke group 1, and then my melodic sample to be in choke group 2, for example. Then we've got time stretching. Again, time stretching, I'm going to go into in more detail in a separate video, because I feel like there's a lot of information in here. There's different modes, different things that we can look at. So I'm just going to do a very quick little separate video on time stretching, talk about how it works with the sequencer and getting things all sort of lined up. Then we've got our tools option. I think that is the final option here. Yeah, we get back to one shots again. If we drop into the tools menu, there's quite a lot of stuff in here. The first thing is labeling. And it is what it says. If we click this here and we're on this selected pad here, which I know are drums, I can label my pad as drums. And it adds a nice little label. You've got to bear in mind that when you're working in this like sampler style workflow, if you've got like 64 of these pads loaded up and you've got a bunch of different like drum loops, it's going to be hard just from looking at the waveform to know which one they are, or, one shots, whatever it happens to be. Just looking at the waveform is not always the best way of knowing what's there. So having a label on it is really useful. So if you're being organized when you're creating your beats and your sort of sketches, keep that in mind to like label your pads as to what they are. Make your life easier. Next, what have we got? We've got crop. So let's duplicate a pad here. I'll duplicate it a couple of times. So now we've got 3 instances of this drum loop that we got here. Let's say on this second pad, I only want the kick drum. Now, it's fine to leave it like that. There's nothing stopping me playing just the kick drum. But let's say I'm going to break this down and there's some export options which I'll get into, and I want to send it to somebody and I just want to give them this nice clean kick drum. What we can do, of course, is we can go into our menu here, tools, then hit crop, and it's going to crop that right down. Now, this is important to mention. Koala doesn't give you any undo function here. So the reason I duplicated a couple of versions of this is so that if I still want to jump back in and find another drum sound in here, whatever it is, once that's edited, I cannot undo that. So that is now baked in like this. If I pull my start and end points, it's only going to be as long as this sample now. Whereas before, when we just edited something down to just like the snare drum, for example, I can play it, but I've still got the option if I want to move things around. As soon as you've hit crop, it's baked down and there's no undo for that. So keep that in mind. There's no undo button inside of Koala. So you've got to be sure about what you're doing and make sure that if you've sampled something that you've got a backup of it in case you need it. It's good practice. So that is crop. Let's see what else we got in here. Normalize. Again, if you're unfamiliar, it's just going to take let's say you've sampled something and the sample's a little bit quiet, or you've loaded in a sample from a sample pack or something, and you want more volume to it. If you hit normalize, it's going to take the volume up to, I'm assuming it's probably going to be like sort of 0 dB. It's just going to make that sample as loud as it can without clipping it. So that's useful. Trim silence is cool. If we go out of here, I've got this set to resampling from app, and I'm going to talk more about that in another episode. But if we set one of our pads to record, as I've showed you, we can then sample, say, this kick drum, because it's resampling internally. Now when we see it, we've got our kick drum here, and it looks like it starts at the beginning of the file, but if we open up the file here, this is how clever Koala is, because it knows that we've created this. It knows that all of that silence that I made by hitting record and then pressing the drum pad, it knows we don't need all of that. So it's just brought our start point right to the beginning. I absolutely love that about this app. It's like really a good little time saver. But what we also have is a bunch of silence at the end of the sample that we don't really need. And this tool of trim silence, if we watch our waveform here, it does exactly that. It trims off anything where there's no audio information. So we've just cleaned that sample right up, and it's exactly the same as our other sample now. Nice clean kick drum. So that's a really useful function. Then we've got auto chop. That is a video in itself, because that is slicing like samples. Gonna go through all the choke groups. Got a bunch of stuff I can talk about there. So we'll leave that one for now. Split stems is the same. I want to make a little video just on splitting stems because there's a lot to talk about. Then we got make mono. So that's as simple as it sounds. You've got, I don't know, a drum loop, something that you've sampled. It's got some panning in it. It's maybe pan to the left or whatever it is. It's kind of, you want it right dead center in your stereo field. We can just hit any pad that's highlighted and convert it to mono. It's going to give us some options here. Do we want to just make it from the left channel or the right, or the left and the right, and just smush them both down into one mono sample file? So there's no stereo information, there's no left and right, everything is just right down the middle. Again, that comes in useful. You'll see a lot of boom bap producers who swear by their drums being right in the middle, no panning left and right. So that's what the make mono does. Then what is next? We've got bounce. So bounce is for baking in effects or changes that you make within this edit window. It doesn't apply to performance effects. It doesn't apply to these. I can show you a way at some other point about how to bake those effects in. But for now, let's say we got this kick drum here. We've got our general options. I want to take out a little bit of noise from the beginning of the sample. I apply some attack. And I want to take out a bunch of the high information. I want it to be like a low thuddy kick. We've got it like that. Perfectly fine to just leave it like that, but again, if I'm going to export this, I want to send it to somebody, or I just want to bake that information down. If I go back to tools here and then to bounce, it's baked that information in now. So this wave file is just set, And we can see that by going back to our attack and our tone, and they've completely reset. So if I wanted to then add more attack, more release, more tone, whatever the effect is that we're messing about with, if you reverse a sample, for example, and then do bounce, that sample is stuck in reverse. You've baked that information in. So that's what bouncing is doing. What is next? Then we've got export. Export, again, it's another video on its own because there are a lot of export options. It's really clever. We can send things as drum racks to Ableton. There's all kinds of stuff we can do. So stay tuned for that video. So that covers the edit window. I hope that was useful. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next video. Take care, and I'll see you then.